November 6, 2003. The sun had not yet broken through the thick blanket of gray that hung over Dry Hollow, Iowa. Frost glazed the brittle grass, each blade stiff and white, crunching faintly beneath the boots of Deputy Mark Ainsworth as he stepped out of his patrol car. His breath billowed in the frigid morning air, curling upward before vanishing into the mist. The wind was low but constant, threading through the skeletal cornstalks still standing in the harvested fields, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and something older, more stubborn, the lingering rot of a wet autumn. Beside him, county social worker Ellen Graves adjusted her scarf and clutched a leather satchel of forms and notes. She was here because of a letter unsigned, postmarked 2 counties over, that claimed the Lehmann family of Dry Hollow had been marrying into themselves for over a century, and that children are born of cousins upon cousins, their faces all the same. It was the kind of claim that, in a bigger city, might be dismissed as spite or gossip. But here, among fields that stretched so far they seemed to swallow sound, it carried weight. In places like Dry Hollow, people knew more than they said, and said less than they knew. The Lehmann property lay at the end of an unpaved road, the ruts deep and filled with rainwater gone to ice. As they drew near, the structures emerged from the fog like a half-forgotten memory, a 2-story farmhouse leaning slightly to one side, its clapboard walls gray with age, a squat barn with a roof that sagged in the middle, 2 sheds of uncertain purpose. There was no visible vehicle, no movement except for the slow swing of a rusted weather vane. Mark shut his door softly, not wanting to announce their arrival too soon. A faint creak cut through the air the barn door, shifting in the wind. From somewhere unseen came the muffled cluck of hens, and beneath that, a sound harder to place, like a low, uneven hum. Ellen paused, eyes narrowing toward the upstairs window. A pale face had appeared there, small, narrow, framed by limp strands of hair the color of straw. The figure did not step back, did not wave or frown, only stared down with an expression too still to read. After a moment, another face slid into view beside the first, so similar in shape and complexion it was as though the same child had been mirrored. They reached the front steps, the wood soft and groaning under their weight. A sour tang of animal musk and old wood smoke hung in the air. The door, painted white decades ago, now peeled in wide strips, revealing layers of weathered grain. Mark knocked twice, the sound dull against the thick wood. There was a long pause before footsteps slow. Heavy descended inside. The door opened to reveal a man in his 60s. His frame was broad but stooped, his hands large and scarred, his eyes pale and watery. He said nothing, only looked from Ellen to Mark and back again, as though calculating whether they were worth acknowledging at all. "Mr. Lehmann," Ellen asked, her tone measured but firm. "We're here for a welfare check. May we come in?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line. After a moment, he stepped aside, gesturing without words. The smell inside was stronger, a mingling of unwashed wool, damp earth, and the faint, sweet rot of something stored too long. The air was thick, unmoving. The front room was dim despite the daylight. Heavy curtains blocked most of the window, letting in only a muted, grayish glow. Furniture was sparse, a sagging couch, a battered table, 2 wooden chairs. Along the far wall, shelves held jars of preserved vegetables, their contents cloudy in the dim light. From a doorway at the back, the 2 children from the window peered in. In the dimness, their similarity was even more striking, same high, sloping foreheads, same narrow chins, eyes a fraction closer together than average. They wore matching sweaters, hand-knitted and slightly too large. Neither spoke. Mark's gaze swept the room, noting details the absence of family photographs, the faint scuff marks on the floor where chairs had been dragged often. In the corner, near the baseboard, a cluster of old tin toys sat neatly lined, each one polished to a dull shine, The man, presumably the patriarch, offered no seat, no greeting. Ellen opened her satchel, retrieving her clipboard. "We've received some concerns from members of the community," she began, "about the children here, about schooling, health, and family structure." At that, the man's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to the children, then back to Ellen. "We take care of our own," he said, the words flat, rehearsed. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the loose tin on the barn's roof. The sound lingered, metallic and hollow. Somewhere beyond it, a faint rhythmic thumping could be heard, like a hammer striking wood steady, deliberate, out of place in the otherwise still morning. Ellen and Mark exchanged a glance. In towns like Dry Hollow, you learned to recognize when someone was speaking to keep you from asking, and when they were speaking to keep you from seeing. Mark made a note to check the barn before they left, because if the letter was true, if generations had lived and married without ever leaving this land, then whatever was happening here wasn't just hidden by walls. It was woven into the very soil beneath their feet. And as they stepped further inside, it became harder to shake the feeling that the Lehmann house wasn't just old, it was holding something in. The deeper they stepped onto the Lehmann property, the more it became clear that this was not simply a story about hardship, but about a family tree grown in upon itself. The origins of the Lehmann family in Dry Hollow stretched back to 1884, when the first patriarch, Wilhelm Lehmann, arrived with his young bride and 2 ox-drawn wagons from a small German-speaking community in Wisconsin. They were not the only settlers that year, but they were the first to stake land on the far edge of the township, beyond the main road and over a ridge that most farmers considered too steep for regular travel. The land was fertile enough, but its distance from neighbors gave the Lehmanns something they valued more than convenient solitude. In those first years, Wilhelm was known in town as a man of few words but quick hands. He built the farmhouse himself, straight and proud, using timber from the surrounding woods. His wife, Elsa, rarely came into town except for church services, and when she did, she kept her head lowered, speaking in a dialect thick enough to make some locals strain to understand. They paid in cash and never owed anyone. Over the decades, the Lehmanns prospered. They expanded their fields, built the barn, and added livestock. But as their financial security grew, their presence in town shrank. The first shift came after a bitter dispute over a property line with a neighboring farmer. The details were never written down, but after the feud, Wilhelm stopped attending church entirely. His children followed suit. The Lehmann name began to fade from school registers, voter rolls, even the county fair contests. By the 1920s, a pattern had emerged. Lehmann children married their cousins, at first distant ones, from branches of the family that had moved to neighboring towns. But by mid-century, those outside connections dried up. The family's oral law declared that no Lehmann should mix blood with strangers, a phrase repeated so often that it lost its menace for those who grew up hearing it. Outsiders were framed as dangerous carriers of sickness, bringers of bad fortune. The enforcement of this rule was subtle but absolute. If a young Lehmann showed interest in someone from outside the family, they would be sent to help a relative on another part of the property for months, sometimes years. Letters went unanswered. Visitors were turned away at the gate. Eventually, no one tried anymore. The property became a world unto itself. The main farmhouse served as the nucleus, with outbuildings converted to crude sleeping quarters as the family expanded. During harsh Iowa winters, livestock sometimes shared the kitchen space, the smell of hay and manure seeping into the walls. Food came almost entirely from the land potatoes, carrots, beets from the root cellar, cured pork from their own hogs, milk from their cows, inside. The family kept to rituals no one else saw. Birthdays were marked not by cakes or gifts, but by reciting the names of ancestors in a candlelit room. Weddings took place in the barn, with vows whispered so low they could barely be heard. The same words were always spoken: we keep the circle unbroken. Neighbors who ventured close enough to see these gatherings described them in hushed tones. One farmer, whose property bordered the Lehmann land, claimed he once heard singing in the dead of night low, harmonized voices, not quite in tune, rising and falling like a tide. Another swore he saw figures walking in single file under the moonlight, their hands linked, moving slowly toward the barn. By the 1970s, rumors about the family had settled into a permanent part of Dry Hollow's identity. Children in town told stories about the white-eyed kids of the Lehmanns, who would appear at the edge of the fields and vanish if you blinked. Adults shook their heads at the idea, but never fully dismissed it. The Lehmanns themselves seemed untouched by outside opinion. Their fields stayed tended, their house maintained, if only at a basic level. Yet each generation looked a little more like the last faces growing narrower, skin paler, eyes just slightly closer set than average. Outsiders noticed, but without proof, it remained only an uncomfortable observation. Even the rare visitor would notice something else: the silence. Not just the absence of radios or televisions, but the way footsteps were soft, conversations low. It was a house where noise was treated like a trespass. The children, in particular, spoke only when spoken to, and even then with a formality that felt out of time. And so the circle stayed unbroken. By the time Ellen Graves stepped onto the Lehmann property in 2003, 5 generations had lived and died without the family tree branching outwards. Every child born in that house carried the combined weight of that history and the narrowing bloodline that came with it. But in the final decades before her arrival, something had shifted again. There were fewer children now, fewer births at all. The land that once supported them fully now showed patches of neglect. Some fields had gone to seed. The barn roof sagged, unrepaired, and whispers in town suggested that perhaps the circle was not just unbroken, it was beginning to tighten. What began as whispers in the fields would soon be laid bare in a series of discoveries no one in Dry Hollow could ignore. Deputy Mark Ainsworth had been in law enforcement for over 20 years, but rarely had a case in Dry Hollow required more than a speeding ticket or a domestic dispute report. The Lehmann investigation was different. It began quietly, with Ellen Graves's initial welfare visit, but within a week it had grown into a slow, deliberate gathering of fragments, each one harmless on its own, but together forming something far more disturbing. The first step was talking to those who had dealt with the Lehmanns over the years. The retired postmaster, Harold Briggs, was one of the oldest living residents of Dry Hollow. His hands trembled as he poured coffee, but his mind was sharp. "Never saw the women," he said, leaning forward. "Not once in 40 years of mail runs. The men came in 2 or 3 times a year, always paid cash for parcels. Never stamps, never letters going out." He paused. "And they never took deliveries. If someone sent them something, they came for it themselves. Always the oldest one." At the feed store, owner Paul Raines recalled something similar. One of the Lehmann boys came in every couple of months for salt licks and feed. Wouldn't look me in the eye. Never talked more than he had to. Paid with bills so worn they looked older than me. Mark and Ellen began piecing together birth and death records from the county archives. On paper, there was nothing illegal about cousin marriages in Iowa at the time, though it raised eyebrows. But as they traced the lineage back, they noticed the same first names repeating across decades, sometimes with different middle initials, sometimes without. The surnames on marriage certificates matched the maiden names on birth records with alarming frequency. The county coroner, Dr. Samuel Holt, was asked to review medical records of births from the Lehmann household over the last 50 years. His notes were clinical, but chilling elevated rates of infant mortality, multiple cases of congenital heart defects, several infants born with cleft palates, and a few with unusual craniofacial symmetry, a phrase he admitted was his professional way of describing faces that looked eerily alike. More troubling still were the records of births that had no attending physician. A significant number of Lehmann children had been delivered without medical oversight, their existence recorded only months or years later, often with vague or conflicting details about the mother's age. Ellen located one woman willing to speak, though only under the promise of anonymity, a retired midwife. She had been called to the Lehmann property 3 times in the 1970s. Her voice shook as she spoke. They kept the room dark, always dark. Said it was better for the baby. I couldn't see faces clearly. The children. She stopped, staring at her hands. They all looked the same. Same eyes, same jaw, like I'd already delivered them before. The investigation gained an unexpected boost when Mark found a stack of personal items in the attic of the old county office evidence from a long-forgotten welfare visit in the 1940s. Among them was a family Bible belonging to the Lehmanns. Several pages were torn out, but others contained handwritten notes, dates of births and marriages that matched the county records, along with strange marginalia in German, too faded to easily read. Then there was the photograph, black and white, edges curling with age. It showed what appeared to be a wedding in the barn. The bride and groom looked no older than 18, their features nearly identical. Behind them stood a line of guests, all with the same pale eyes, the same narrow faces. Someone had taken a knife or blade and scratched out the eyes of every person in the image. The most startling discovery, however, came not from paper, but from memory. A local man named Charles Denton, now in his 60s, remembered trespassing on the Lehmann property as a teenager. We'd heard the stories, he told Mark, so me and my cousin went up there one night. We hid near the barn. There were candles lit inside, and singing. Not church hymns, something else. And in the middle of the barn floor, a couple stood while an old man said something in German. When he was done, everyone clapped once, just once, and then they all held hands. Didn't stay to see more, we ran. Each piece of testimony and every document added weight to the same conclusion: the Lehmann family tree was not a branching structure, but a tight, twisting lattice that doubled back on itself for more than a century. It was no longer a rumor whispered in the aisles of the feed store. It was an observable pattern, undeniable and deliberate. The question now was not whether it was true, but what it had done to the people living inside that house. And to answer that, they would have to go deeper into the Lehmann property than anyone from outside had gone in decades. The pattern was no longer speculation. It was a lattice of bloodlines so entangled that unraveling it risked breaking what remained of the family itself. The warrant to search the Lehmann property was granted on a cold, windless morning 2 weeks after Ellen Graves's first visit. The fog clung to the ground like a second skin, muffling sound and muting color. Mark Ainsworth led the team 2 deputies, Ellen, and a county translator familiar with old German dialects up the dirt track. The patriarch stood on the porch when they arrived, his arms crossed, his jaw set. He didn't shout or threaten. He just stepped aside, eyes fixed on the barn, inside. The air was thick with the smell of old hay and something metallic beneath it. Dust floated in pale shafts of light that pierced the gaps in the walls. Wooden beams groaned overhead. Along the far wall, a row of hooks held tools, pitchforks, shovels, an old scythe all neatly arranged and oiled. But it was the floor that caught Ellen's attention. Near the center, under a scattering of hay, she noticed a square outline in the boards. Mark knelt and brushed the hay aside, revealing a trapdoor with a rusted latch. It took effort to pry it open. The hinges screamed in protest. The smell that rose from below was damp and stale, tinged with the sourness of aged paper. A narrow set of steps led down into a space no higher than a crawl. The walls were lined with crates, all sealed. In the corner sat a single wooden chest, its lid secured with a simple latch. Mark opened it and the air seemed to thicken. Inside were bundles of folded paper tied with string, a stack of small cloth pouches, and several envelopes so brittle they threatened to crumble at a touch. The papers were birth records, not official forms, but handwritten ledgers in a careful, looping script. Each page listed a child's name, date of birth, and the names of the parents. Over and over, the same surnames appeared in both columns. In some cases, the same name was written twice, father and mother identical. The cloth pouches contained locks of hair, some faded to yellow-white with age, each tied with a paper tag bearing initials and a date. At the bottom of the chest lay something stranger, a folded parchment covered in a family tree drawn by hand. It started with Wilhelm and Elsa Lehmann at the top, the branches descending in pairs. But as the tree reached the later generations, the lines doubled back on themselves, looping in small, tight circles until they became almost unreadable, a tangled knot of ink. The translator's face tightened as she read the notes in the margins. "It says here," she murmured, "that the bloodline must stay pure of foreign seed, and that to stray is to bring sickness." DNA samples taken from surviving Lehmann family members confirmed what the papers suggested. Multiple generations had produced children from unions between first-degree relatives, brothers and sisters, uncles and nieces, aunts and nephews. When confronted, the patriarch spoke without shame. "The world outside is poisoned," he said flatly. "We keep our own safe." His voice carried no malice, only conviction, as though he were explaining why the sun rose in the east. 3 younger family members, all under 20, gave statements. They described being told since childhood that no other man is worthy and no other woman is pure enough for them. One boy, barely 16, admitted he had never spoken to anyone outside the family except at the feed store. "They said strangers would look at us wrong," he said quietly, "and they'd try to take us away, inside the house." The investigators found the upstairs room stripped of anything personal. No photographs, no decorations, only beds, plain quilts, and shelves lined with the jars of preserved food. The walls were bare except for a single framed phrase, stitched in faded thread, "Keep the circle unbroken." As the search wound down, Mark stepped out into the yard. The fog was lifting, revealing the sagging barn roof and the tilled earth beyond. For a moment, the property looked almost ordinary, just another farm struggling through a hard season. But in the ground beneath his boots, in the walls around him, and in the people who had lived here for generations, the truth had been buried in plain sight all along, and they had finally unearthed it. But even as the state moved in, one final, almost unbelievable truth was about to surface, and it was buried in plain sight. The days following the search were a blur of flashing patrol lights, unmarked county cars, and strangers with clipboards walking in and out of the Lehmann farmhouse. 3 adult members of the family, the patriarch, his eldest son, and a middle-aged woman identified as his niece and wife, were taken into custody. The charges were complex child endangerment, unlawful marriages, abuse, and neglect. None of them resisted. They went quietly, as if the world beyond their fence line was already lost to them. The younger family members were placed in protective custody. Some stared silently out the windows of county vehicles. Others clutched at the door frames as if afraid the road itself would swallow them. In the county shelter, they moved like shadows, unused to open spaces or the hum of fluorescent lights. The property itself was seized under emergency authority. County officials walked the perimeter with clipboards and cameras, cataloging everything from rusted tools to broken window frames. The land, more than 60 acres, was later auctioned to cover the costs of the state's intervention. No one in Dry Hollow bid on it. In the end, an investor from Des Moines bought it sight unseen, only to have the house and barn torn down within months. In town, the case became an open wound. For weeks, reporters descended on Dry Hollow. Their vans lined up outside the diner and on the courthouse square. Some locals refused to speak to them. Others saw an opportunity to repeat every rumor they'd ever heard about the Lehmanns. But beneath the gossip ran something heavier shame. Not because the Lehmanns had lived as they did, but because no one had stopped it sooner. It was right there. One farmer said to the county paper, "Right under our noses. We saw those kids, we heard the talk, and we just let it be." The genetic tests, sealed in court records, would later be cited in medical journals as one of the most extreme cases of sustained inbreeding in the Midwest. Experts who reviewed them spoke in the flat language of science: recessive genes, congenital disorders, high mortality rates, but the reality was far more human. It was the story of children born into a circle so tight it strangled their futures before they'd taken their first breath. Years later, the land where the farmhouse once stood became overgrown. The tilled rows reclaimed by prairie grass. Hunters sometimes crossed it in autumn, noting nothing more than the uneven ground where the foundations had been. But in Dry Hollow, the name still carried weight. Parents warned their children, "Don't wander past the ridge after dark." That's Lehmann land for the survivors. The world outside was a slow, painful adjustment. Some found homes with distant relatives. Others drifted through foster care. A few tried to change their names, but the resemblance, the pale eyes, the narrow jawlines made anonymity almost impossible. In small towns, faces are remembered. The Lehmann story was folded into local folklore, told in low voices over coffee or on long drives down the county roads. It became less about the details of genetics and more about the dangers of closing a community off from the world, about how fear of outsiders, of change, can curdle into something that poisons its own roots. Looking back, Ellen Graves would later say that what struck her most wasn't the secrecy or even the tangled family tree. It was the quiet conviction with which they had lived it. They didn't think they were hiding a crime. She said they thought they were protecting themselves. And that's the tragedy. The files are closed now. The land has changed hands. The barn, the house, the circle all gone. But questions remain. Not about what happened, but about where else it might be happening. Beyond the ridges and the fog. In the places no one bothers to look. Because for every twisted family tree that's been uncovered, there may be another still growing unseen, silent and unbroken. How many other twisted family trees still grow, unseen, in the quiet corners of America?